When did you graduate from Hamilton College, and what was your major?
May of 1980, with a double in English and theater.
What campus organizations were you a part of when you were at Hamilton?
I wasn't. I did a whole lot of theater shows, almost all under the auspices of the department. So, like, I don't know if the Charlatans still exist, but there was a theatrical group called the Charlatans that happened. I never did anything with them. So there was a lot of extracurricular, but I did not belong to any groups. I did a little bit of tutoring of local kids at the very beginning. This thing called the Utica Tutorial. And yeah, not a joiner. Also, once you get all that theater going on, it's almost impossible to do anything else and get grades.
Yeah. So aside from theater, the next question was like, what extracurricular activities did you do? Was theater like all encompassing?
That was the biggie.
Yep. Okay. When you were a student at Hamilton College, were you out?
No.
Are you out now?
Yes.
And while you were a student at Hamilton, what was the climate like for LGBTQIA students?
There virtually was no climate. I think you could say that in a way the problem was not hostility, the problem was that one didn't exist. That would, of course, be especially true of transgender, which did not exist as a word or as a category then. The word may have been introduced, but the only word that generation, that we knew at that time, was transsexual. And the assumption was that such a person would have been operated on top and bottom, male to female, because doing bottom surgery female to male was not possible then. People who you would call trans today simply had to fit into something else. We had a technical director in the theater who was a woman who was extremely masculine. She might call herself trans today. She was also a lesbian. That was the only category there was for her. Bisexual, a little earlier in the 1970s, bisexuality was almost the hip thing. But it was generally assumed to be something temporary. It was not taken seriously as a thing for life, and it was really not talked about much. Probably talked more about among the women, because then we had Kirkland, and the women at Kirkland were freer, more flexible thinkers, a little more daring. Many had come there because there would be a feminist environment. So I was exposed to feminism, lesbians, bisexual women at Kirkland. Hamilton, I mean, I suppose, you know, it's like you see and you know, but you don't know. So I would say that the environment, you know, there wasn't any environment for us. The environment was one of, you know, simply erasing us, indifferent to us. And then if you pushed it, if it became obvious, hostility. And of course, there was the usual jokes, the usual remarks, you know, don't drop the soap in the shower when he's in there with you, But if you ask the person, yeah, well, what does that mean? They just probably sort of vary it. Now, that said, there were some fairly obvious things going on if you knew where to look, but you had to know where to look. And even those obvious things were often, people will tell me these stories in retrospect, oh, it was so obvious because so-and-so, you know, in my frat was always bringing these guys home from Utica, and, you know, they'd still be there in the morning. And, you know, I was trying to figure out what was going on. But I never, ever heard of anyone doing that in a dorm. Oddly enough, the fraternities, which was the hypermasculine atmosphere, it was actually easier because there was a sense of ownership about the house and there was a little more separation between living spaces. But anyway, just come circle back to the original question. You know, it was like what atmosphere?
Huh. Interesting. And how far-reaching do you think that the like free thought of Kirkland College was on like Hamilton students? Like, do you think that like it was easy for people to learn about and access this new kind of thinking, or do you think that you and your ability to like counter this new concept was unique to you and few others?
Basically, you had to cross the street. The open, progressive, whatever atmosphere stops at College Hill Road. You know, you had to physically go over there. Yeah. Not that Kirkland women didn't come to the Hamilton campus for classes and so forth, and some lived there. Some even went to Kirkland as a way of being able to go to Hamilton. Because Hamilton didn't take women, Kirkland didn't take men. And then exactly halfway through my college career came the merger. So I belonged to the only class that had half and half. I would say, yeah, you had to go over there, and you know, it was quite predictable. The guys that you would see hanging out in suites at Kirkland, all that kind of thing. You know, they were the guys who were probably gay, except again, since it wasn't talked about, wasn't acknowledged very openly. That was their place, but you know, I say that in retrospect, sort of. Now, after the merger, there were more men living on the Kirkland side. In fact, I lived on the Kirkland side most of my last 2 years. So more men living over there, more men at McEwen for meals. You know, it was sort of a little like an invasion. I believe it's true that to this day, that side of the campus is a little more, whatever you want to say, maybe a little more bohemian, maybe a little more progressive, whatever. I know, if not, I know that for many, many years after the merger, the divide continued to exist geographically. There was a cultural geographical divide years and years and years after the merger. I don't know if right to this day it persists.
As a student here, it does feel like it still persists today as well.
They tried to bridge that literally by building Martin's Way and the Phileas Events Barn and all of that stuff, so that there would be a place that was, you know, so there'd be this like continuum from one side to the other. Because before all that was built, it was really a hike over to Kirkland. You had to use that road that's farther up and walk in, and I don't think that building all that stuff, as nice as it is, really changed that.
Interesting. So kind of moving on from the general climate and more to you specifically, did you face any personal hardships connected to your LGBTQIA identity while you were a student at Hamilton?
Yeah, I didn't. I was not owning that identity, but I did have an identity that was, you know, I had an identity, and it consisted of various parts of feeling sexually inadequate, feeling socially inadequate, you know, feeling incapable of fulfilling a typical male role. So it was all that stew of stuff, although I had not put any label on it yet. I was not singled out and picked on. It was that I more in that environment felt alienated, left out, unwanted, except when I was over at Kirkland with Kirkland friends. It was sort of passive harassment. You know, I think especially today, with all that we are aware of, someone who meets me would figure out I was gay pretty quickly, even if I gave no information. then you sort of had to be, for someone to pick up on it, for most people to pick up on it, you had to be fairly, I don't know what you want to say, outgoing, not outgoing, flamboyant, effeminate, whatever, these words that kind of feel almost a little retro now.
Mm-hmm.
Although there were people who were like that and nothing was ever said. I don't remember any incidents. Again, it's the invisibility.
Yeah.
You know, we were so unimportant and so little thought of that we weren't even worth picking on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's, you know, and it sounds great. Oh, you didn't get picked on. It's like, well, yeah, we were completely ignored, which is not a good way to go out into the world. You know, the period from being 18 to being 22 is very important in forming your identity. If you basically are told or understand that, you know, you dislike yourself or have anxieties about yourself in all these ways, but none of it's worth saying, addressing, you know, it's not even worth putting down. You know, and then you go off into the world with all those encouraging graduation words and speeches and everything, which you kind of think you don't exist. And I hit New York City, where, boy, I sure found out that I exist, except I was existing among 8 million people. So that was a whole other funny thing. But yeah, it really started life on a very down kind of note, to come from, you know, this place of non-existence. And then it's like, hey, you know, happy sunny day in May. Here's your diploma. Congratulations. Wow, what you going to do? Great. Congratulations. You're wonderful. You're blah, blah, blah. And, you know, I felt like shit on graduation. I felt like shit. You know, you get in the spirit a little bit, but generally it just emphasized what a failure I was, that there was this great celebration day, and, you know, it just wasn't a good start in life.
And would you say that, like, that feeling of invisibility was the most difficult part of it all, or do you think that there was something else that was, you know, like, even harder to deal with?
I think kind of the number I did on myself based upon input from society was the worst part. The invisibility, see, I didn't necessarily want to be visible. I didn't talk to anyone. This was not a coming out, but I did have a conversation about it with someone in like the late winter of my junior year. And then gradually I came to the coming out over the next 2 years. But since I wasn't looking for visibility, it was a sort of a strange situation. I did wish that the environment was less conservative. I might wish that it was more tolerant, but not that it would accept gay people, because I wasn't one. Maybe yet, probably not. I hope not. Maybe, you know. There was all this crazy stuff going on that I had picked up well before Hamilton, and Hamilton seemed only to reinforce it, which was not Hamilton's fault necessarily. I think that almost any college like that at that time, except maybe, you know, Bard or Hampshire, was probably pretty, especially rural colleges, were pretty backward in that way and kind of conservative. You know, when you probably see this among your peers, when you're young, you think that the thing you're complaining about is this uniquely terrible thing that you and your friends have discovered that must be cursed and fixed right now. And then you grow up and you realize, oh yeah, but everyone was like that. You know, not that those social ills don't have to be fixed, but, you know, some of us demonized Hamilton at the time. It was really not Hamilton necessarily that was the demon. But just to come back and reinforce kind of a more solid answer to your question. Yeah, I didn't really, I didn't think of in terms of invisibility, because I didn't think of wanting to be visible. I don't even know if I thought that I deserved to feel more comfortable in society. I thought, I got to change myself so that I'm the kind of person who will feel comfortable. At the same time that I resented the atmosphere that I was in. But I would say some of the societal expectations that I had started processing to my detriment, in ways that were to my detriment years before, that was the hard thing. And it's just like the pressure increased and increased as adulthood got closer. And, I thought, like, how am I going to survive, as this kind of bizarre person with this bizarre head? Because I had other things going on. I was, a little subject to depression. I was a little subject to obsession. What else? Was in my head a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So there were other things that might be related that were making it difficult.
And can you specify, like, exactly which societal pressures?
Well, to be a certain way as a male,
Mm-hmm.
To do certain things and do them in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like, there was a way of being that was so clear to me, and it was so clear to me that I was not it, but it's hard to characterize.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of anything else to say about that, oddly enough, for someone so talkative.
So kind of the flip side of that then, what was the best part of of everything? What was the best part of being LGBTQIA at Hamilton College? Even if you didn't,
Well, again,
identify as
remember that I wasn't. But I would say that, as it does everywhere, the arts provided a little more flexible environment. That environment was equally silent about those things. There are all these gay boys going around and zero acknowledgement of it. I mean, zero. Here and there there'd be something. And again, the bisexual and lesbian women were much more visible in the theater, because at Kirkland they could be. But the young men, and I get sort of all tied in knots because two of the young men that I think of as having been so obviously gay, one has spent his life unpartnered, the other got married to a woman. And yet they seemed obsessed with each other at Hamilton. So there's all these like peculiar kind of dark stories out of the dark ages. And I guess they still exist. I'm on a campus here, but I don't intersect with undergrads very much. But there were all these things that would leave you wondering, is he or isn't he? Are they or aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
You would have guys would like room together all 4 years, would always be seen together, there seemed to be this almost telepathic, unspoken communication between this intense bond, and they graduate and poof, gone. One would go one way, one would go the other.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, what happened? Was that really just plain male bonding? Is there no deeper secret here? So you got all these sorts of unusual things, some of which I assumed were gay, some of which I guessed, I wondered, I don't know. But being in that theater environment was certainly nice, also because, forget the LGBTQIA part of it, it was just the artistic part of it and the fun of putting on a show and, the group activity and the lights and the laughs and the applause and all that great stuff. And a somewhat more accepting environment, although ironically, is this going to be published in a way that's linked to my name?
I think it will be.
Okay, we're not going to tell this story then.
Okay. maybe after I turn off the record button, because I would be interested to hear.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to park this one because it is interesting. I'm actually going to park 2 theater stories. Ask me about 2 theater stories when the recording is off.
Yeah.
What else was good about it? It's interesting. I found a group of, as far as we know, all straight, although I have my questions, guys that I hung out with, especially sophomore, junior, senior year, who somehow were accepting enough that I think so long as I said nothing about it, and many never guessed, and many I don't know because I don't see them anymore, but it seemed to be a fairly accepting group of me and whatever it was that I was.
Mm-hmm.
And they were not particularly a hyper-masculine bunch. They were not dating all the time. They were not all the time talking about, oh yeah, I went back to my room and fucked her. I mean, pardon my French, but that's what you heard a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So I found this somewhat more eccentric, accepting, odd group of guys, and hanging out with them was fun. We'd order pizza and watch Saturday Night Live and play endless rounds of backgammon. The women who visited the suite were not all girlfriends; they were just women who were friends sometimes. So there's not a lot of pressure to be a certain kind of man with these guys, although they were all, at least at the time, straight, and the ones that I'm in touch with or know anything about live very straight lives now. One of them here in Ann Arbor. So that was fun. So those 2 things really, I found comfortable spaces in those 2 things, but there was no protection from some of the thoughts, fears, anxieties, inadequacies. And then even when I was in the presence of guys who were comfortable in that way, it was always in the back of my mind, if they only knew. This friend of mine, sweet mate of mine who's now here in Ann Arbor, told me a couple of years ago, he said, you totally could have told me. And then before I could say anything, he said, but I totally get why you didn't. So I was like, thank you.
Kind of going back to one thing that you mentioned earlier, like noticing these like very intimate male bonds and kind of questioning whether they were just like friendships or if they were something more. Do you think that everyone on campus had like an eye for that and was like noticing these bonds that were occurring, or do you think that was unique to yourself, or do you think it was like a campus-wide acknowledgement that something may be going on here?
I think that thinking about the particular 2 guys that made me say this, I doubt that anyone else thought it for very long. I mean, that would certainly not be anything that anyone would have wanted to think, right? No one had any reason to want to think that. And usually people only think what they want to think. So, anyone would have looked at you and saying, well, they're friends. And I don't think that anything actually physically happened between them, is my guess. No idea, because I didn't know them that well. I just have this idea. There was another 2 guys who were perhaps talked about that way a little more, but not really that much. 2 other guys who actually were gay, but they really stuck together. I think they were roommates for 2 years, but they really were just friends. Yeah, I mean, I think especially to some women, because, you know, straight or gay women are just a little more perceptive about this stuff. The thought may have crossed their mind. There was really no context to place any of this stuff in. To say, oh, you know, John and Jeff, and not their real names, clearly. You know, you think John and Jeff are gay? It's like, it would take much longer. It's like a difference in computer power between then and now. It would take so long to process that, because I think that most straight people back then didn't quite understand what gay was, which sounds weird to say, right? Yeah, it's like two people of the same gender in love and having sex. What's so hard about that? But they would have had no exposure to it, so they wouldn't really know what it was.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the first gay couple that I knew was the first one I was in.
Mm.
I never knew a gay couple until January 1982, when I became part of one.
Mm-hmm.
Problem.
Yeah.
I thought that all it was the male version of a straight couple, and so I knew what that was. And of course, the fact that we weren't really married, of course we weren't. We were gay. So, you know, did I think that it was stressful not being married? Wouldn't even occur to me. So there's so much that people just didn't have the processor to handle back then. Even though, you know, of course they knew what gay was. Of course they could give you a dictionary definition. But I mean, to this day, I think most, you know, I think the attitude, and perhaps understandably of most straight guys, would be like, you know, why do I have to know that? I accept my friend, my brother-in-law, whoever. Yeah, they're part of the family. They come over on Thanksgiving. We all watch the game together. You know what? It's their business. You know, all that stuff. They have no motivation to really get what it is. Mm. Even though I'm wandering a little far afield here, but I think that, you know, we now have the world of the bromance and so forth. And I predict that's going to go further and further. We also have today, and I guess you know all this, but I'm just sort of saying it for the tape or whatever, you know, the whole thing about androphiles. So, you know, they're not gay, but they're into or attracted to men. So I think that some of those walls are coming down. And I think straight men do understand some things better than they let on. Mm-hmm. But again, if you're talking about how a potentially gay situation would have been looked at back then, yeah, people didn't have the tools really to say more than, you know, make a joke in passing and move on.
Yeah. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, but still related to Hamilton. Did you engage in any campus activism for the LGBTQIA community, or like, was there even a way to be an activist?
In that particular area, there were no ways to do it. There was an LGBTQ, it actually would have been just LGB back then, group called Sappho, and it was for the most part all female. When I was there might have been like one guy attending now and then. Mm-hmm. Obviously, based upon the name, its origin was at Kirkland, and there probably was not a lot of outreach. So no, there was no activism. A couple of years later, there was a little. Mm-hmm. The major issue back then was the merger, or if you prefer to call it, takeover. And I think there was some protesting about that, but it was kind of a done deal by the time it was announced. There wasn't much way to change. I mean, Kirkland was in huge debt, and there was just nothing to do about it.
And were both sides protesting that merge, or just one side, or?
I think that Kirkland was the students. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Hamilton wasn't like against becoming co-ed. That's why Kirkland was created back in the 60s, was that, you know, the old farts didn't want Hamilton to be co-ed. By 1977, 78, I mean, the student body, you know, co-ed was the rule by then. Yeah, no one was bothered by that, but Kirkland, I think, felt, you know, they were being taken over, forced, et cetera, the things men usually do to women. So there was some pushback about that. People wore, for at least the next 2 years, men and women both, some would wear these green armbands at graduation. The first merged graduation, which was May 1979, most of the women carried green apples that they took up and handed to the president when he gave them their diploma. That was about the only thing I remember any extended activism over. There wasn't a lot to be an activist about at the time. There's a lot of stuff that wasn't known or thought about yet. Vietnam, which had consumed the like half a generation before us, was over. Yeah, we were the me generation, supposedly.
Mm-hmm. And so the next question was maybe not relevant since you kind of answered it, but just in case, you know, I don't want to miss anything. It was about activism off campus and with the LGBTQIA community, and like, did you engage in that? But it sounds like it didn't really exist off campus either, or is that, what was it? Did it Utica or other places?
No, I mean, I remember nothing. I mean, Clinton, New York?
Yeah.
Seriously? Utica, you know, Utica has been in financial decline for like 150 years. I guess they're coming back a little bit now, but I'm trying to remember the history behind it. The first Woolworths was going to have been in Utica. And it's either that it wasn't and it was somewhere else, or there were two of them and the one in Utica was closed. But when Woolworths either didn't build or pulled out of Utica, that was the start of the decline. And then, oh boy, there's a whole thing about the geography of the Erie Canal and the Mohawk River and Utica. And like Utica's kind of in the wrong place. I think the Mohawk flow north or something the wrong way. Mm. I would have to go back and look at this, but Utica ended up poorly positioned geographically and in terms of business. And so, you know, when I was in college and they'd pick you up, I'd take a cab, say, from the train or the bus. I mean, you'd drive past blocks, you know, ruined factories, ruined houses. It was sort of the 1970s New York State answer to Detroit. Wow. It was just a wreck. And when I was there about 10 years ago, it looks a little better.
Mm-hmm. And so the time there was just like no room for activism for.
I mean, I'm sure there was some, but again, protesting was not the thing of the day. That had really ended with Vietnam and the end of the Nixon White House, which is how we sort of got stuck with this me generation. You know, that we were all self-centered and we're about ourselves, and it's like, no, the generation before us was afraid to go to Vietnam, so they protested. Of course, I mean, afraid, I'm say with total justification. Mm-hmm. You know, and it was distasteful of them to go for a war that they did not support. And again, that's totally my point of view. But there was some selfishness also in protesting then, in some of it. But then all that stuff, all those battles were won. The war ended, the draft ended. You know, Stonewall had happened. Houston had happened for the National Organization for Women. Civil rights era in the 60s had happened. All that stuff had been won. And we were sort of taking a breather. We didn't know it yet, but we were taking a breather before AIDS came along, which would be the next major thing to have protests about. So not, in my perception, a big activist time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So now we're about to move on to the last part of the interview, where it's just general questions about your life now as someone who is LGBTQIA. But before we move on entirely, is there anything about your experience at Hamilton that you feel we didn't cover that you want to talk about?
Yeah, one of them, it's those two-part stories, so I'm not going to tell them
Okay.
while it's recording. Is there anything else? Well, I wish that I could say more, but between my own kind of closetedness and the fact that so little was going on, it's really hard to form a picture, let alone think of a lot of details.
Mm-hmm.
I remember it was, this is someone you're probably talking to, in the fall of 1978, a guy named Scott Klein, who had just graduated the spring before, or maybe it was later in the 78, 79 school year, he returned to campus. He'd not been out on campus. He was out, and he came and spoke about being closeted and being gay at Hamilton, so like right after graduating. And that created a bit of a sensation. He was fairly well known on campus. He worked on The Spectator. He was active in his fraternity. He was someone that people knew. Mm-hmm. And for him to come back and give this very highly visible talk, I mean, people actually had more than one sentence to say about it, although not much more.
Yeah. And which year was this that he gave his speech?
He's a member of class of 78, and I would say that it was sometime during the academic year that followed. Mm. Maybe like spring 79.
Mm. Yeah. Is that so? Do you feel ready to move on to the next portion?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Awesome. So, what impact did coming out or being LGBTQIA have in your work life?
In my work life, I can't say. I don't think that I never spotted a time when I was definitely discriminated against or mistreated for being gay. Mm-hmm. The most abusive supervisor that I ever had was a lesbian. She knew that I was gay. So, of course, I expected better from her. Mm-hmm. She was extremely castrating. So, because she was gay herself, it's like the whole psychology of it was so bizarre. She was also extremely, misandric. She hated men. She had a 40-plus person department with no men in it. Mm-hmm. And she achieved that by firing the only 3 men that she had, one of whom had a disability. And how she got away with all that, I don't know. But so I felt sort of like I was part of a club of men who was mistreated by her. In the following job, I definitely think there was some homophobia coming from the HR. It was a very small place, so HR, finance, and all that was just rolled into one person who was problematic in a number of ways, but I think homophobic for sure. It was a think tank. It was an international relations think tank. And I just think, in the international relations field, especially for like maybe starting a generation before me, maybe even starting with my generation, gay doesn't exist. Because, of course, you're going to countries, or especially in the old days, we're going to countries where it really and truly had better not exist. And so in any kind of foreign service, diplomacy, everything, that was just totally shut down. So these people at this little think tank, I was working in development for them, you know, they were, of course, nice Manhattan liberals, but they just had no ability to process it because it was in a field where it was kept so quiet. The previous job with the abusive supervisor who hated men, that was an environment where you really would have expected. Very open LGBTQIA. Elsewhere in my work life, I freelance now, so I don't think people worry too much about it. You know, if they don't want a gay person in their environment, well, they don't have one. I work at home and come into the office, you know, once a week, say, here's the latest thing I did for you, and nice curtains you put up, and goodbye. So I think that it's probably, and you know, there are secondary effects of being gay, being trans, bi, whatever, in that, you know, if you have a lack of confidence, you don't feel comfortable with yourself, all of those things impact the work life. And I would say that's more the issue than that person X or person Y treated me badly.
And what about your family life? How did coming out or being LGBTQIA, what impact did that have in your family life?
Let's see. By the time I came out to my mother, she was getting on in years, and she kind of had no choice but she didn't like to talk about it, but she had to be accepting because I was really all she had. My sister was all the way on the other side of the country, didn't visit very much. So my mother was pretty dependent on me. And whatever she thought of gay issues and that sort of thing, you know, being suitable, to use one of her mother-in-law's favorite words, kind of took precedence. So you didn't talk about it. You didn't want to have a conversation about it. You were suitable, and you said it was fine, and that was that. My sister seemed fine about it when it came out to her back in the early 80s. She has since become a Fox News Republican, and God knows what she thinks.
Oh dear.
I have very little interest. My dad never found out. He may have sensed, but he never knew. His sister and her family, it's my aunt on my father's side, that was a bit of a more progressive family. So it was much easier talking to them about it. All my cousins are fine, except there's one who's kind of religious conservative, but she puts family first, which I do have an issue with. You know, I don't like homosexuality, but I love you, kind of thing. But I'm not that particular cousin. I'm not that close to, so I don't really care what her, you know, I don't care. Yeah, the cousins' children I see now and then. My sister's family, my niece and her children, they're just strange and very secretive. They don't stay in touch. You know, so who knows what they're thinking. I'm about out of patience trying to figure it out or worry about it, especially since you've got my sister, you know, praising Justice Scalia and saying that anyone who voted for was stupid, and then repeating the word stupid 3 times. You know, it's just like talking about, you know, carrying on and on about voter fraud, and it's like, whose child are you? You know, my parents were Eisenhower Republicans. They'd be repulsed by all this stuff that's going on. So, yeah, running out of family. And then my partner's family, I keep saying partner because that's what I said for so long, husband's family, they're all pretty great. He's the kind of guy where you either accept, you know, you don't have a choice, you accept, you know, because you do. And so therefore anyone he marries, you also accept. Now, that said, you know, his family's pretty great anyway. You know, I think even if he were more retiring, that they would still be very accepting. but he's pretty out there.
And what about your social life? How has coming out affected your social life?
Well, in the beginning in New York, there were a lot of theater people. So I just went ahead and assumed that everyone was fine with it, which wasn't always true, but I just blithely went ahead and assumed that. And many of the people I interacted with were gay. And then a rather interesting thing happened in the early 1990s. I'd had a problem with some compulsive sexual behavior, and there is a 12-step group for that is exclusively for gay men. There are, in fact, a number of groups for compulsive sexual behavior because they all have a different slant on what constitutes sobriety or recovery. You know, with AA, there's only one AA because you put the bottle down and that's it. But there are all these different sexual recovery groups with different kinds of definitions, agendas, and points of view. Well, there's one that's gay men. And that was my first introduction to like having tons of gay friends, was going to that group, going to those meetings. And suddenly, and, you know, they're friends in a kind of funny way, but I was suddenly plunged into this very active life. I'm going to the theater with this one, going for coffee with that one, drinks with that one, play a game of Scrabble with this one, all this stuff going on. And in that window of time, I was also single, so it was a very nice thing to have. So that was the time when I knew the most gay men and socialized with the most gay men, and really from across the spectrum, because those 12-step groups really, they really catch everyone of every class, every income level, not so much every race. The gay male community has not been good with integrating black and white at all. And I place the blame firmly on the white part of it. Although I obviously know that African-American gay men have, you know, a unique set of circumstances and struggles as well. And then after that, you know, I went to the meetings a little less. I was in the new relationship with the guy that I'm married to now. And, you know, it was a mixture of our friends. You know, all were perfectly fine with me and with him and with everything. A few drop away over the years just because they do. The move to Ann Arbor has been interesting. There's seems to be a relatively high lesbian population in Ann Arbor, but and there are, you don't somehow hear from the gay men as much. I mean, they're there, but you're really aware of the lesbian presence in town. And I think there are four lesbian couples who are friends with us. Some there's a professional connection as well. In one there's not. But gay male couples, you know, we know of a few, but really don't know them. And I actually, so funny, I met this guy the other day. He was a married gay guy, he's in his 30s, and I think I almost spooked him a little by saying, you know, I don't have any gay friends. I want to get together sometime, and we'll go out for coffee, or we'll do this. It's like almost like, you know, please be my friend because there aren't any others. And also because my husband's in social work, you know, we do well with the socializing with straight couples, because in social work, of course, they all know that they have to be not just nice to the gay people, but like practically, you know, with their feet. Our neighbors, we're pretty lucky with neighbors. We have this really interesting couple next door. We think the husband is kind of not alt-right, but kind of far over there. But, you know, he seems to love us, as does his wife. There's a couple across the street. My husband works with the wife professionally. We get together with them. We're doing Thanksgiving with them. They're great. They lived in New York for a while, so it's a little more cosmopolitan. And then the woman next door is fairly friendly with us. And the couple beyond that we see fairly often. You know, she and my husband have a lot in common. She's a psychologist. He's a social worker. Her husband is also a writer, as I am. So we hang out occasionally. I mean, Ann Arbor is an exception. Ann Arbor really kind of belongs to the East Coast. When we go from here and we visit friends in like Milwaukee, Fort Wayne, Urbana-Champaign, Madison, and then we come back here, it doesn't feel, you know, we feel like we've come back to the East Coast almost. There's, you know, it's very progressive here. The University of Michigan is like a top-rated university with tons of like international talent at U of M. I think it's rated like the #1 or #2 public university in the country. So it's really more of like an East Coast social atmosphere. Very different thing when I went to give a reading from one of my books and to hold a writing workshop at Purdue University, which is in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I can just feel the change. Driving there in the car, getting out, parking, but I could feel the difference. Not necessarily around gay things, because everyone who was hosting me was somehow part of that or sympathetic to it, because I'd come to read from a gay book, and I'd, you know, that's my identity as an author, it's my identity as a person. So I was really surrounded by liberals and gay people the whole time, but in the atmosphere, you could feel it's very different. So the whole point being, speaking from Ann Arbor, I'm speaking from a perspective that is really not the Midwest. Really, not the classic Midwest at all.
And what do you see so you said East Coast kind of has these like progressive ideas. What do you see the ideas of the Midwest being? How would you describe those?
Well, the Midwest is, first of all, everyone's more isolated than on the East Coast. You know, Gertrude Stein made the famous comment, the thing about the United States is there are more places where people aren't than where they are. Really applies. I gave the example of Fort Wayne, Urbana-Champaign, which has got a state university, but, you know, Illinois is flat and brown, basically. And Urbana and Champaign, one is a slightly liberal town, one is a conservative town. They've got a state university there, but, you know, their main street is 3 blocks long. Ours is, you know, an entire chunk of downtown. It's small. These are isolated, even in 2017, these are isolated towns. People often don't leave them. You know, there are many people who have been their whole lives here, and it applies to both Ann Arbor and other Midwestern cities. Sports, especially football, is an absolute, like it's a bedrock part of life, particularly in university towns. I've only lived in the Midwest 2 years, and again, I'm in the part of the Midwest that isn't classic Midwest, so I've got to think about my trips outside. I mean, you know, obviously you've got, you go outside Ann Arbor, and you will start to see Confederate flags, you'll see people carrying guns, you will, you know, there have been swastikas spray painted on campus. I think that happens in the East too. Confederate flags, not so much in the East, I don't think. There seems to be a lot of hoarding in the Midwest. It's interesting. Many of the people I've met in the Midwest have been hoarders to one degree or another. That's just totally out of nowhere. It's just a kind of a curious thing. There's still a little bit of a pioneer sensibility. The Midwest, once upon a time, was the West. What else about the Midwest?
Yeah, like just if you could just describe, like you said you could just feel it, like when you got out of the car, like what exactly was that like feel? Like, could you just describe that?
Dull, like lack of excitement compared to what I think of excitement as, you know, look, 35 years in New York City, maybe I shouldn't, you know, try to compare. A little bit of a sense of being cut off. mean, the distances are much greater. We think nothing of driving 6 or 7 hours to visit someone. On the East Coast, that's like driving from New York City practically to North Carolina.
Yeah.
Something you wouldn't do just at the drop of a hat. But here, you know, so-and-so lives in Iowa, someone lives in Louisville. Hey, let's go see them. Because that's the scale on which you're operating. What else about what I just feel? There's a sense that there's kind of one way to do things.
Mm.
There's a sense that there's a sense of discouragement. Disappointment. I think of this, this isn't exactly Midwest, but I watched this film last night called Meek's Cutoff by Kelly Reichardt. And it's actually about pioneers in Oregon in the 19th century. And it's very, even though that was Oregon, but like I say, this part of the country used to be the West, and it really portrayed the pioneers' kind of world and mindset really well. The isolation, the fear, the uncertainty, the pride in in hauling and lifting and sweating, which I guess translates in a more modern way into having worked in like manufacturing or farming in the West. You drove home through Indiana and you like these vast cornfields, like one house in the middle of it. Well, you see that in New England, but eventually you see a whole bunch of houses. In Indiana, half an hour later, still just, one giant cornfield after another with one house in it. Obviously, I exaggerate a little, but that distance,
Mm-hmm.
that distance and isolation.
And so we've talked about the impact that coming out has had on your work, your family, your social life, like kind of what it means in terms of like community. But what has it done in your spiritual life?
My spiritual life. Well, it certainly made me not wish to belong to my church, not because they were anti-gay. The United Church of Christ, congregationalism is pretty bland. Mm-hmm. They're not against very much. They're not for very much. They're just like generic church. But I still felt that there was this thing about you better be this way, or they're saying it really nicely, but you've got to conform. So I went through like a little religious phase as an adolescent, and then right after that just dropped it. And I kept it dropped for a long time, not because I didn't like Christianity, but because I just wasn't finding anyone who was practicing it in any way that I could handle. And then my aunt's family, my father's sister, they were Quakers. My aunt had gotten it from her grandmother, who was also a Quaker. And for some reason, she had this idea that I would like a Quaker meeting if she could just get me to one. And I said, well, she doesn't really know, she and I have never discussed anything like this. Why does she think that? And I never knew why she thought it, or just that. Anyway, we went. And I was like, oh my God, this is the way to do church. No one talks. Everyone shuts up. And they speak only if the Spirit moves them. And although not fabulous about LGBTQIA issues, the Religious Society of Friends is pretty good. I get annoyed because in New York, they would have like World Trade Center conspiracy theories up on the bulletin board, but nothing about marriage equality. And I thought, come on, people. But I like that much better. in Ann Arbor, unfortunately, the Society of Friends is kind of, it's been a little bit de-Christianized. So I'm not too happy with that. Neither one of us is. I still go to meetings, my husband doesn't. He also, because it's a very white group, and they even did, they tried to do like a diversity initiative, and their conclusion was that there was no need for it. Oh. And when he heard that, he was like, I'm done with these people. So yeah, I was kind of flabbergasted. I was like, they did this whole stuff in Ann Arbor. They must have had like professors who know about this stuff, and they still came to the conclusion that there was really just no real need or interest in it. This was all pre-Charlottesville, pre-Harvey Weinstein, pre-Donald Trump, not pre-Donald Trump, but pre-Trump presidency, that they came to this conclusion. I hope it would be different now, but anyway. And so, but I don't think that I will ever be like a really, really good Christian type, because it feels too straitjacketing to me, even in so flexible a form as the Society of Friends.
And so what exactly is like you said like one of the things about your Christian faith was that it was like bland, you said, and they weren't necessarily for or against. What, I don't have a good sense of what like Quakers believe in terms of like LGBTQIA issues. Do they have like a strong stance that they like really push for?
Well, there are two things going on here. When I spoke about the blandness, I spoke about what I was born into, which was the United Church of Christ, okay, which is Congregationalism, the Protestant sect. And the Congregational Church actually has 4 different C's. That's SEE, and it's like a division of a religious organization. Some more conservative than others, but all pretty bland and mainstream. And you know, it is generic Protestantism. And in the 90s, they did this thing about churches becoming quote unquote open and affirming. And I think that was across Protestant churches. And my former congregational church in Connecticut became open and affirming, and you know, there was a little opposition, but really not much. The Quakers, the main 2 tenets of the Quakers, or the main 2 that I think of and you know cotton to, are one, they are pacifists. Actually, 3 things. They're pacifists. They believe in personal revelation, and they believe that Christ is within. They speak of the Christ within. And the meetings, there are Quaker meetings that are programmed, and so there's talk and there's singing, as there would be in most church services. The classic Quaker meeting is silent unless someone feels especially moved by the Spirit to stand and speak. They are great about progressive causes. Generally, LGBTQIA is not one that they really take up. Once they take up arms, but they're pacifists, so that doesn't work. It's not one of their big causes. Their classic cause is pacifism. You know, the environment, they've taken up fracking. You know, social justice issues, prisons. Prison reform is big with Quakers. So LGBTQIA has been pulled along with all of that, but it's not really one of their big things.
So this question is kind of a meta question. What are some of the biggest challenges facing the LGBTQIA community today, do you think?
Homeless LGBTQIA youth, I think, is pretty big. while there's a lot of acceptance in some parts of the country, there's a lot of rejection in other parts. I think it was in Rolling Stone that the article was published about the young woman who came out to her family. And I think she did it, I forget how she did it, but a little bit of time passed. She got a phone call from her brother, and he simply recited, he said, you know, your credit card is going to be cut off as of this date. You will take the car, you will bring it to this place, leave the keys in it, it will be picked up. He just went right down this laundry list of things, of ways in which she would be cut off from the family that basically added up to everything. And she was going to school out in like Idaho or Montana. She basically had to sleep on friends' couches and have all these meetings with people in the school to try to continue her life, which she eventually did. You know, she was one of the lucky ones. You know, she was already in college. She came from a good family, even though they were cutting her off. But there are kids on the street. There are kids on meth. There are kids, you know, trans kids who can't get hormones because they've been thrown out of the house. They have no money or no access, or they don't know that there's a free clinic they might be able to go to. So I think that youth, I think particularly trans youth, homelessness and, you know, being rejected by families, being displaced, all of that is, I would say, probably issue number one. Employment discrimination, the general cloud that has come over the country the past year or so, in a number of ways. Employment's one of the big ones there, but that was there before. Before the whole Trump thing, there were still a lot of states where you could be fired for being gay. There are some inroads being made in fundamentalist religion. I don't know if you know do you know who Matthew Vines is?
No, I don't.
He's this guy from Kansas, from a religiously conservative evangelical family. And he went to Harvard and became obsessed with studying the Bible and what the Bible really had to say. And if he could make some inroads into evangelical Christianity, he left Harvard. He did indeed make those inroads. His organization is called the Reformation Project. And slowly, evangelical America is being brought around. Unfortunately, I think that it is probably that part of evangelical America that's already educated, middle to upper class, kind of people who've got it all going on, except that they are conservative evangelicals. When you come to evangelicals who are, you know, and like Matthew Vines' father was, I mean, this is not true, but it's something like, you know, he's a professor and he's got a degree from here and he's active in this. So he's like, he might be evangelical, but he's really primed to be a convert to the LGBTQIA kind of thing. I don't know if any such inroads can be made with poorer, more isolated evangelical communities. So I think the religious conservatism, especially among those who are poor, isolated, utterly unexposed to certain people and ideas, I think the fact that so much of the country is in the control of that population and other kinds of deplorables, as Hillary would say, is a problem, because right now those people have a disproportionate voice because of who's in the White House. And it's suddenly okay to say and do all kinds of terrible things to LGBTQIA folks, to refugees, to immigrants, African Americans, all that. So everyone's on the run, everyone's on the defensive. And I think there's that chunk of poorer evangelicals, more isolated ones, that just, you know, they'll never reach as good a job as Vines and his people have done with kind of the upper end evangelicals. So class is an issue. Do you know a book called The End of Eddie?
No.
Get it, read it. It's actually about growing up among deplorables in France instead of the US, but it's like everything is directly transferable. It's pretty hard to take, but it's a phenomenal book. This guy's 25 years old. His name is Edouard Louis. The End of Eddie, Eddy. It's really fabulous.
Oh, yeah, I'll have to read that. Okay. Do you think there's anything we missed, or is there anything that you feel like you want to add to this interview? One thing actually that I wrote down and then forgot to ask you about is your book. What do you write about? What are your topics of interest?
I've got 5 published books. 4 of them are under my name. The most recent one is a young adult book, and then 2 other novels for regular adults and a book of short stories. And I also, a few years ago, I thought, what the heck, I wonder if I can do erotica. And so the one published under another name is erotica, not because I was ashamed of it or anything, but because at the same time I knew I wanted to try the YA. And I thought if the YA is more successful and I develop a name in that little world, you may not want to know that the erotica is there. It's probably a baseless fear, but just to be safe. So there's these 5 books and bunches of short stories and essays and things, even a couple of poems. In the young adult novel, I did try to capture some of this kind of like not knowing what it is you don't know. Mentality. What exactly is it that you are and why, and do you have to tell everyone? And the young man has a girlfriend, and he's got to explain it to the girlfriend, and he, the chapter in which he does explain it to the girlfriend, what's it called? It either is or was called by some phrase like, I think that's what it's called. And he's always telling her, I think this, I think that, but he doesn't know. Meanwhile, she's crying and doesn't know what's going on. And, so everyone gets kind of damaged by this weird intermediate phase where you sort of don't know what it is you know about yourself, or don't want to, what is it you do or don't want to face. The other books don't deal so much with that.
Do any of the other books have any content that specifically relates to the LGBTQIA community, or is that the only?
They all do. They all do. That's all I write about.
Huh.
That's all I write about. There are straight characters, but it's basically, a gay world that we're in. A couple of the short stories are not particularly queer. But otherwise, that's my thing.
Yeah, so sorry, I kind of asked what I thought I missed. But is there anything that you wanted to talk about that wasn't brought up?
I don't think so. I've said this before. I wish there were more to say, but it was really private turmoil was the difficult thing in late 70s Clinton for me, not anything public, because there was nothing public. It was just an assumption of indifference and hostility and disappointment. That those were or would be the 3 reactions. And really there's only one person at Hamilton ever knew that I had those things going on while I was there. The other 2 people I talked to pre-coming out were from other parts of my life. And then I was one of those people, like when I came out, then suddenly everyone had to know. Hey guys, I got a new identity. I had new cards made up. So I've never been to a reunion. They say that the reason you go to high school and college reunions is not to be who you are today, it's to go back and reenact who you were then, which I can't do. Hence, I don't go. I'm not sure that I didn't think it out that way, but I wonder if that isn't it. that there is no 1979 David to go back to. He doesn't exist. So it's like, what am I going to do at a reunion? I'm a different person.
Mm-hmm.
There's a break in the continuum. I have been back to the campus, just never to a reunion. Yeah, that's about it.